hop in because it's a topic near and dear to my heart. And it's all about being ready for the things that you may know are coming down the pike or you may not know. But it's crisis communications, really important topic, I think, for many of us, especially after watching what happened over the last weekend, right? So before we start, though, two things. I want to share something on Facebook, I believe, and then also let you know how to submit your questions. If you want to submit a question, you can just look for the Q&A button and type it in there. I've gotten one question emailed to me in advance of this, and I'll answer that as soon as I can, towards the end probably. But just, if you think of something in the middle of this, just pop down to the Q&A button. I guess it's up at the top of your screen. It's at the bottom of mine. And then also you just type it in there, and I'll go through those towards the end of the session. So the reason I wanted to do this particular topic was that many years ago, probably the reason I am in this position now, and the reason many of you know who I am, and I've worked on communications for years, was it goes back to many, many years ago when I was working with Drew Johnson at the Tennessee Center for Policy Research that has been renamed to the Beacon Center. And we put a little press release out about Al Gore's energy use. And from the moment that press release went out, I hate to admit it, I was caught with my pants down, basically, to be crass. I was not prepared for the amount of vitriol, personal attacks, just incoming media requests, needs to respond to those, needs to get Drew, on interviews. I was not ready for that. And we had dealt with some what would be considered crisis communications issues before, but nothing on an international scale. And after that experience, I made it a mission personally to understand better how to be prepared for the unexpected without ending up like completely, that's all you think about. Because, if you let that fear get in the way of forward progress, that's not good. And really, it's not fear that motivated it, but more like I could have had a much easier time. So what I think went really well years and years ago, when we as a small starting organization had a flood of inquiries and attacks and all of those things coming in from a press release, was that we sat down, we took a pause and developed talking points. And the thing about Drew and working with Drew that's always been great is that guy can come up with clear, concise talking points. He's pithy, he thinks on his feet. So he was a great spokesperson. The other thing that was good is that Drew is good at making media hay. So he was able to like glom onto that opportunity and expand it. And we had a couple of things not set up for the scale of attention that we got from that. And we were, however, able to recover quickly. So of course our website went down because Drudge put it on their website. And I was able to, through a personal relationship with our host, call the host and say, hey, our website's down. And in the background, I already hear their engineers yelling, they're on Drudge. So they had already noticed it. They were proactive. Those things went really well. We also were able to bring in friends and family to help man the phones to handle the volume. Well, that was just luck, right? I didn't have that plan written down, but I sure wish I had. So this is what I think we should have done better. I think we should have been like prepared for the additional attention and had some additional clarifying press releases ready to go about the organization, about Drew, about, some sort of way to address the accusation that you always get when you hit a chord that your funding is somehow unfairly impacting your content. All of those things we know are going to come when we hit a chord with communications. I think we could have tapped in better to the situation to raise money if we would have had email blasts with language ready to go that we could insert the details into. That could have helped us more quickly tap into that fundraising opportunity. I think we could have asked for phone support from our existing base, and that would have helped relieve some of the people who are just getting constantly yelled at in the situation. And I would have personally known better to ignore the jerks, but that just comes with age and time, right? So this brings us back to crisis communications. To me, I see really two parts to crisis communications. One is your preparation, and two is practicing communicating under fire so that the day you are under fire, you're ready to go. It requires some practice. It requires putting attention to those things. And for me, the basic principles of crisis communication, be prepared with a plan. And by that, I mean a written plan. And I know we all have a lot of work to do, and it's not always fun to write it down, but the day you need it and it's written down, and for me, it's got to be printed out in a binder so I can flip through it, right? The day it's written down and easy to find is the day that you didn't have to run around making up talking points in the background or drafting a press release when much of a press release is template language, right? So that's pretty important. Never lie. Something happens. So let's say that one of your employees is at a bar, gets drunk, and starts spouting language on behalf of the organization that is completely unacceptable and not even where you come from. Are you prepared for that? Well, if somebody calls you and asks about it and it's happened, the wrong thing to do is to deny it. If they've done something, then you should own that. And I think about the Tylenol situation where they had I think it was cyanide in their pills and people died. They didn't run away and say, nope, nobody died, no, we're not talking to you. They owned it. They uncovered the facts of what happened, and they made changes to their product packaging so it could never happen again, because that happened because of a package tampering. So they took what was a horror. I mean, if you are a supplier of headache pills and your pills kill people, that can put you out of business like that. Well, they didn't let that happen. They were ready to go with a response. They examined the problem and they took care of the problem and they communicated about it. The other thing is, don't make things up. Don't guess what might have happened. If you're hearing, well, what might have happened, if you're hearing yourself say that, shut up. It's okay to admit when you don't know, and you need to go find out the facts. And it's, you can get their numbers and call them back. Making the media wait too long, however, while you verify facts, can also make you look squirrely. So you have to be careful how you communicate that and make sure that you're able to rapidly uncover what's going on in a crisis situation. I think first, and the other thing you need to keep in mind is to handle your communications with grace and poise, even when people are yelling at you, because sometimes they're gonna. And what people remember is your tone of voice, the look on your face, and your ability to listen and respond. It actually reminds me of, well, never mind, I won't tell that story right now. We got to get into the meat of this, don't we? So just think about how your tone is. And if you have trigger signs, like for me, if I'm under fire and it's hitting my heart and hurting my feelings, which happens all the time, the whole fight or flight thing, I get tight here in my throat. My face turns red. It does this when I'm happy to. And sometimes I just have to own what's going on. But the minute I feel that tightness in my throat, to me, that's a trigger warning to step back in my head mentally and realize that while somebody verbally might be coming at me, the worst thing that can happen is they're yelling. Meh. It's not like there's a gun to my head. It's not like I'm being thrown in jail, right? I'm being yelled at. So what? It's, there's nothing physical, but you'll have a physical reaction. Now, so learning your warning signs for that is how you can then practice poise. Even though the one thing I can't change is the fact that my face will turn red. Sometimes I'm just embarrassed and my face turns red, whatever. Okay, so I want you to go somewhere with me for a minute. So think about you've spent all day cleaning the house and you have made a beautiful dinner for your husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever. If you're not in a relationship right now, somebody you like, best friend, and it's like steak and wonderfully toasted asparagus, and you've made potatoes, and it's got a beautiful salad that you got from local sources, and it's just fantastic. You've got the candle going. And then they, at the end of the meal, lean in and say to you, well, that was a marvelous, marvelous meal, kind of. You know, actually, the steak is very good. Those potatoes were smooth, mostly. You know, that salad is really well thought out, and the flavors were arguably balanced. See what I did there? These are weasel words. This goes back to being prepared. Weasel words sneak into our language when we're nervous. And so I think the first thing to think about as you're developing your messaging is these words that we tend to use when we're thinking about what we want to say next. They hurt us more than. Would you want somebody to say that the meal was good? Kind of. Not really. And when you hear yourself saying kind of, it's almost like a like. It's like the like that we all do, right? So weasel words are the first thing to look at if you hear yourself saying them. Again, silence is better than a weasel word. The only time I have seen actually work really well in communications is when somebody says something that is wrong, and it's the first word you say, and it's combative. And if combative is the approach you need to take with that discussion, then you can say, actually, your data is incorrect. However, you sound a little less snotty if you don't say it, but it's a word. That's where I've seen it work. So a plan helps you be prepared for what to say, so you don't resort to weasel words while you think about what's next. So the next question is, and probably why you are here, what goes into your plan? I wonder how many of you have plans. I wish you could raise your hands. How many of you have plans ready to go? I'm thinking about a friend of mine who worked at a large network of nursing homes and put together their crisis communications plan. And one single nursing home, I don't know if you remember this news story, had somebody who needed CPR, and one of the nurses working there refused to give it to the person, and they died. And the reason the nurse refused to give CPR was that she did not want to be sued if she failed. Imagine if you're the communications director of that organization when you find out that happened. Well, here's what they did. They had the plan. They had press releases drafted, ready to go in case somebody had died due to their own negligence. And they managed to communicate the facts to the media, and they had it communicated through the specific facility that had the issue. And the larger conglomeration was never really touched. And that's because they owned what had happened. They talked about what they were going to do to change it. And they didn't try to weasel out of it or put spin. And they did it quickly because they had already written that press release, not for that situation, but they had one that was close enough that it probably took 5 to 10 minutes to have a media release ready to go. So here are the elements of a crisis communication plan. First of all, you have the plan, and the plan should outline and explain how your organization will communicate about crises and handle them. And it should have, the purpose of the plan, explain why the plan is needed, activation criteria, very important. What makes us go into this plan, and under what circumstances do we use it? Procedures, so outline the ways that you're going to be taking steps and what steps will be taken and how that works internally. Like if somebody who's an entry level, let's say some intern just came in, if they come across indication that you might be needing to activate your crisis communication plan, who do they tell it to? How do they get it up the chain? What if it's a Saturday? Those sorts of things. And then have the tools that you need that are ready to go, so that when the crisis happens, you're not running around trying to figure out how to write the right media release. And I think for me, having thought about chain of command and who's responsible and who's on the communications team and what the key messages are, all of those things just make you more prepared. That doesn't sounds like a lot of work, doesn't it? It can be a lot of work. I think the cool thing about a crisis communication plan, though, is if you spend time thinking about all the bad things that can happen and then prioritize the ones you think you're most likely to have to respond to, you don't have to write it all at once. Like once you've gotten chain of command, all of those things put together, um, it's really then about developing content. And as communications people, you know that you create content a bit at a time over time. So you can say, okay, this one's the most likely one to happen. What are the talking points? Let's get our draft resources together, media releases. You might even have some social that you want to put together, anything that's going to communicate about that so that you can grab it, look at it, verify it fits and go, or make adjustments and go in that situations. Is everybody oriented on how to take care of a crisis? Okay, this is what we do. You see how that ends up being a bolster, but it doesn't have to be written all in 1 week. So let's, excuse me, there we go. So let's talk about this. So that's the plan. Crisis team. So who is on your crisis communications team? Is it just you? Gosh, I hope not. The crisis team needs to be your core team of people that you can talk to in a crisis. And for me, that means who are the spokesperson or people at the organization, like the main one, that they need to be on the crisis team. If a crisis happens, they get activated. These are the people who, if Sunday night at 4 p.m. there's a problem you have to deal with, they've agreed to give up their personal time to come onto your team and help. And they understand. Well, okay, so if you just have one spokesperson, guess what? That person could have something. They could be vomiting with the flu. They could be in the hospital because they are the crisis. They were, in a car accident, and that's the thing you have to communicate about. So make sure you have the spokesperson, it's clear who it is, and you have your backup spokesperson so that there's 2 or 3 people who are able to respond to a crisis. You also need somebody who's very good with strategy and somebody who can keep a cool head under fire, because sometimes your crisis communication team, you'll have people who are better at that than others, and you want that perspective. Personally, on my crisis communications team, I have somebody who is completely out of my organization to help. They are not involved. They don't exactly understand what we do. And they are the person that I can say, okay, we're going to say this about X. Does that make sense? Does it address the problem? Am I missing something? Am I too libertarianly focused for this to make sense? And they can give me that feedback. And they've agreed to serve on my crisis team so that we're ready to go. And then lastly, very important about the crisis communication team is to keep it simple. So you want to set up who's on the core team, clarify how the decision-making process works and who has final say if you don't agree, and then make sure the whole company's oriented on the process. And by which, I mean, when you're bringing new people in, you say, this is what happens if there's a media request. This is what happens if you notice that there's a problem online or otherwise. This is who you tell and how chain of command goes. So that's just how you put your team together. And then, of course, you write that all down so that if for some reason you're the person who's unable to oversee how this happens, somebody can grab the book and say, okay, Nicole's out. So these are the other people we need to bring together and let's go, right? The documentation is key on this one. The next thing you need to develop are your key messages. And this is where you get to go big and have dreadful discussions with your team developing this and then prioritize. And I just talked to somebody over at the Mackinac Center a couple weeks ago who said they've gone through this process, and they said they had this brutal day where they sat in their conference room and just wrote down all of the horrible things that could happen, like that employee recorded at the bar and it comes up 10 years later, or somebody who steals a ton of money fraudulently from the organization and now your credibility is at risk with your donors, or your attendees at an event ate food and it had botulism and they all died. You see how this can turn into the gloom and doom thing? Somebody had an affair, and part of what you're working on is all about ethics, and that's not very ethical. Or in Mackinaw's case, and I'm sure this, I don't know if they did this before or after, but when Joe Overton died in a plane crash, that was something they needed to communicate about. Like, a key employee has just died. What, oh no, what does this mean for the organization? And so you just talk about all these horrible things. And of course, yes, some of them are reputational. Some of them can be an assault, you know, like somebody was at the wrong protest rally, were photographed and associated with somebody we don't want to be associated with at all. How are we as an organization going to explain that one of our employees was over there and what they were doing, and how is that reaction going to happen? So as you're developing this list, you just go big and you write all this stuff down. Then you prioritize the top five key messages that you're going to have to develop. And by this, I mean like the 30 to 60 second thing that you can say, the supporting information, and maybe a couple of examples or stories that you can have to clarify what's going on. You want to have that for that. You also want to have it for your organization, because the next thing that happens in a crisis is they're like, well, who is Spark Freedom anyway? And where did they get their funding? And all. So you need to have that answer ready to go, or those talking points ready to go. You're going to want to have this developed for your key executive and public facing people. Again, prioritize. You don't have to write this all in one day. And then also your core products and services, or in the policy world, I would say your top policies. You know, if you're working on educational choice, just be ready to go to talk about, yeah, this is what this is why we do it. You know, we want kids to get a good education, and the way we see that happening is X, Y, and Z. And then you have supporting information if they need it. And once this is all put together, it actually helps you develop something we'll talk about in the resources section, that is, you know, like you have the talking points and the messages, and you know what your core is, and like the real core points, not like 10 points, like 2 to 3 points. And then you can build that into fact sheets that you think media or anybody else would want to know about if that issue needs to be brought to the forefront. Next, and this one takes a while. This one I actually tend to do, like after the brainstorm, I do the internal procedures, which is a little bit different. It's internal procedures. And this is, you know, ways and methods and the flow of information and all of these things that come up when you need, and it actually relates to your general communications. You know, it's probably very similar to how a commentary gets developed at your organization or a report. But this is, so what happens if there's a crisis during business hours? Where do you meet? Who's making the decisions? What's the chain of command? What if the chain of command is broken because that's part of the crisis and they're no longer in the room? What happens after hours? Who gets called? What is the expectation for responsiveness? What do you do if one of those people is just, you can't get them? That's pretty important, and it's important the employees who are in your A team after hours know that they're there, so they understand to look at the text messages and to tell you if they're going camping and won't have access, so they're out of the game. How do you handle media inquiries? This is basic communications 101, guys. Somebody calls in, what are the questions that you ask? I have a form developed that if I'm not here and somebody calls in, you can just ask these questions. I need to know who they are, who they're reporting for, what the story's about, who else they've already talked to, when their deadline is, all those bits, how to call them back. Helps me prepare to call them back if I know all of those pieces of information, and I can look a little bit. So how is that handled? And, you know, people who are taking those calls need to know not to wing it. Most of us, I think most of our network has handled these issues pretty easily. Crisis communications approvals, again, I keep hitting that because in a crisis, if your main spokesperson is the person who has to approve all crisis communications thing, and they're also the person talking to the news, running around, going to studios, on the radio, that might not be the best choice. They may have to entrust somebody who is not running around, because it's hard to give approvals while you're sitting on television. So that's why I keep nailing that one. And chain of command, likewise, what to do when it's broken. And then documentation location. This is the oft forgotten thing about a crisis communication plan. It's great to have your plan, right? It's great if it's on my desk. What if I'm not at my desk? As I said, I like to have it printed, but I also have a digital copy I can access basically anywhere there's internet. And it's okay to have more than one copy as long as they're kept up to date. So you need to know where it's located, how many versions there are. If you change something, like how many, like do you need to go to the president's desk and change it? You need to change it in yours? You've got the person who's head of your policy division, like whoever it is, make sure that those updates in the printed ones are taken care of all places, right? So that's internal procedures. And then my favorite part, and this is the most powerful part of the communications, crisis communications plan for me, it's the media statements and templates. And this is like after you develop messaging, you have a media statement template that you can just fill in the blanks on. And then you actually write them for those top 5 things that could happen, so that if it happens, you're ready to go. Same with press releases. A media statement's, this big, and the press release is the bigger explanation of something. So you have the template ready to go, so you can fill in the information. It's formatted. You can just pop it out, and then you have them written for your top 5 issues. You have fact sheets. So fact sheets are wonderful. This is where, when people are going to be asking questions about your organization, you can just be like, this is the fact sheet about us. It's that simple. I actually, obviously there was a lot of communications explosion after this weekend in Virginia. And one of the most useful articles I found were like the 7 things you need to know about what happened there. And it was just a fact sheet. And I'm not saying that was somebody's crisis communication, but that's the way to think about your fact sheet. Like, what are the 5 things that they need to know, or the 3 things, or the 7 things about Spark Freedom, or what are the 7 things they need to know about educational choice, or what are the 7 things they need to know about our vice president who just died in a plane crash, right? So just get those fact sheets going. Media contact lists. This one seems so simple. We all have one. Make sure it's accessible not only to you, but everybody on your crisis communications team, so that if you're out of the loop, they can help you reach out to those people. And then digital assets. Like, how many of you have seen the photographs of people who look like this in a crisis? Those are horrible pictures. You improve your chances of not having a horrible picture of somebody from your staff taken up by the media because somebody grabbed the shot, if you can give them a decent looking headshot, like this is the person. Now, of course, people who want to manipulate you and use those awful looking pictures are gonna do it. But I like to make sure that, like, here's the logo of the organization, it's the right one. Here's the headshot of the people we're talking about, it's the right one. Here's a picture of the event, it's a picture of the event. Like, those things that they can just have access to, very helpful if you have urgent communications. And then having your social and digital documentation in hand is great. A lot of, like, at my organization for a long time, only one person could post to social, because what you don't want when you're doing social, right, is to have conflicting posts and not timed well and all of that. Well, that's all well and good, but if that person's out of hand, out of pocket, and I don't have the passwords, then I'm in trouble. So having that documentation just about the standards for social, which many of you I'm sure have already developed, is good. And then also having just the basic documentation for how to get into all the accounts, because that's like the worst thing. You need to tweet and you can't tweet because you don't have your password and it resets to an email that you don't have. Like, imagine how that could go in a crisis. That would not be good. So those are the basic principles of how to develop your crisis communications plan. I can take questions again in that Q&A button that's towards the top. Just throw your question in there. I do have one question already. Before I do that, I do want to mention, if you're interested in working with us to develop a crisis communications plan, we actually are launching a webinar series in October 4th. And it's only $195. There are 7 sessions to walk through each part with time in between for you to do it. And then we can share what we're learning along the way of developing the plan. You just go to sparkfreedom.org/crisis comms. And with that, I had an emailed question in from Michaela about Facebook, and she asked me about it was a reputational question. So she has had a bunch of trolls hitting their website with 1-star reviews, and they are not actual reviews. They're from people who don't like them for whatever reason, and they're throwing in these 1-star reviews, and she's wondering what she can do about that. And that kind of goes to reputation management a little bit more than crisis, but it could cause a crisis because you don't necessarily want people going to your Facebook and seeing a bunch of bad reviews. And Michaela, this is what I would do in your shoes. The first question I would ask is, are they actually hurting your Facebook results? Like, are people looking at your reviews, and is it having a negative impact on your Facebook success rate? If the answer to that is no, then I'd be like, meh. I'd go get people who love your organization to leave whatever review they want that are positive. I, just encourage people to give you good reviews. There's no way to stop the troll doing the 1-star thing, and it is a tactic that has been employed recently also for some of my private industry businesses. So that's the first thing. Now, if it is causing a problem, what I would say about that is that you should look into turning off comments. You can report bad reviews to Facebook, and they can decide if they're going to take them down or not. They aren't very responsive. That is what it is. They might take them down. So if you can report them, then go for it. But you can, like, I went in to verify this because Facebook changes things. You can turn off comments to turn off review. You can just be like, nope, we're not taking any more reviews. Then they'll stop. You can't get good reviews, but you're not going to get more reviews, right? Like more bad reviews. So that's what I have to say about that. If anybody else wants to weigh in, like, shoot me an email and we'll include it in the webinar notes when we put the replay session out on our website next week. Okay, next question I have from Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin. Do you have any advice in regards to crisis for international organizations? For example, student activists in Venezuela. Ooh, that's a good one. Caitlin, I see no reason why a student activist, or if you have a leader of that team, can't go through the basics of developing a crisis communications plan. Now, Venezuela is a hot ticket, and it's actually the kind of crises that they're going to be running into seem to be more objections or verbal assaults in the debate, would be my guess, unless they're like picture taken in the wrong sort of place. But I'm not sure that's what you're facing there. I do highly recommend, as part of your crisis communications plan, finding the top 5 reputational, or 5 or 10 reputational assaults that will happen, and developing the answer to that question. And we have a process here at Spark Freedom we go through called objection reframing. And it's not confirmed yet, but I was looking at having Kevin Karen next month to walk us through how to develop objection reframes, just as an add-on to this. We will certainly have that as part of the webinar series that for the crisis communications plan developed. Just, how to take an objection, and basically you need to understand the core complaint or intent of the objection, and then look for what about that core objection or complaint is good for you. And then you say, well, basically that means this good thing. It's not spin. You're not, if the complaint is valid and whoops, then you're not going to reframe that. But you can own the frame on a lot of what people are throwing at us just verbally when we're in debate. So, for your student activists, I'd really recommend that they find gentle ways to reframe the top objections that get thrown at them, and realize often the person that you're trying to persuade in that situation is not the person who asked you the question. It's everybody listening to how you handled it with grace. And so, returning to a jugular assault when somebody's going for your jugular is not always, in fact, it's often the worst thing you can do, because then you just come off looking like a jerk. Instead, if you can answer it in a way that seems reasonable to the rest of the people in the room, you've won that debate. That person may never change their mind, but you have won that debate. So with that, are there any other questions? I've had two, but I'm not sure we have. I'll give you about 30 more seconds. The show notes for this will come out, I think, Monday or Tuesday. It will include the PowerPoint, so you just sort of have those basic plan elements to refer to, and you can look, of course, at this recording again if you like. You know what? I forgot to check Facebook and see if there are questions there. There's usually, hold on, 1 minute. I need to stop screen share. Sorry, it's your facilitator working on her computer. So let me look for any questions over on, and this of course is me going clickety click click click. I cannot find the post on Facebook, Tim, for what that's worth. So I think, excuse me while I awkwardly go to our page. This is awesome. Okay, so over here in comments, I also don't have any questions. So with that, I will wish everybody a wonderful day. Tune in, it's September 21st, and I can't guarantee we're doing objection reframing, but I can guarantee if we don't do it in September, we're going to be pushing for that October or November Spark session to be on objection reframing. We haven't done one on that, and I think it's time to do it. So everybody have a great weekend, and thank you so much for tuning in.